The November mists of 1895 had settled upon London with particular malevolence, transforming our familiar Baker Street into a realm of shifting shadows and muffled sounds. I had been reviewing my notes on a recent case involving forged banknotes when the familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade echoed upon our stairs, though his usual confident stride seemed markedly hesitant. Holmes, who had been conducting some arcane experiment involving tobacco ash and various chemical reagents, looked up from his work with that peculiar gleam in his grey eyes that invariably preceded our most intriguing adventures. Lestrade began without preamble, his weathered face bearing an expression of genuine bewilderment as he settled heavily into the chair beside our fire. "I come to you with a case that defies every principle of logical investigation I have learned in 20 years with Scotland Yard." Holmes set aside his magnifying glass with deliberate precision, his aquiline features sharpening with interest. "Indeed, Inspector. Your reputation for finding the mundane explanation in the most extraordinary circumstances is well established. If you confess to bewilderment, the matter must possess genuine intrigue." Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. "Old Silas Grieve was found dead in his cobbler's workshop on Cobbler's Lane, a narrow, fog-shrouded alley in Clerkenwell where honest folk fear to tread after dark. But it is not merely the fact of his death that brings me here, Holmes. It is the impossible manner of it." I prepared my notebook, sensing the approach of one of those cases that would challenge every assumption about the natural order of things. Holmes had begun his characteristic pacing before the fireplace, his movements betraying barely contained excitement. "Grieve was discovered by Constable Pike during his midnight rounds," Lestrade explained, "after hearing mysterious sounds emanating from the supposedly abandoned workshop, a rhythmic tapping, like hammer on leather, and the intermittent chiming of a doorbell. When the constables finally forced entry, they found the premises secured from within by no fewer than 3 separate mechanisms: the main lock, an inner bolt, and an awl cleverly wedged to jam the bolt in its socket." "And the deceased?" Holmes inquired, pausing in his perambulations. "Found behind his counter, apparently dead of natural causes, though his face bore an expression of absolute terror. But here lies the true mystery. Holmes, the workshop had been sealed tight as a tomb for 6 months, ever since Grieve's disappearance last spring. Yet someone had been working there recently. Fresh candle wax, the scent of leather and turpentine, and most peculiar of all, a single set of bare footprints in the spilled cobbler's wax, prints too small for any man." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that fierce intellectual hunger I knew so well. "You mentioned sounds, Inspector. The tapping, was it regular? Methodical? Ay, like a craftsman at work. But when Pike investigated, the sounds ceased, only to resume moments later, as if some phantom cobbler continued his eternal labor, undisturbed by mortal interference. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of our fire and the distant rumble of London's restless night." Holmes stood motionless, his brilliant mind clearly racing through the implications of this extraordinary account. "There is more," Lestrade added reluctantly. "Among Grieve's effects, we found a commission book with a recent entry, a pair of ladies' boots, ordered by one E. Hexley for delivery this very week. The strange thing is, Holmes, we can find no trace of this customer, and the entry appears to have been made in Grieve's own hand, despite his supposed death months ago." Holmes turned from the fire, his face illuminated by that expression of supreme confidence that never failed to inspire both admiration and trepidation in my heart. "Inspector Lestrade, you have presented us with a most fascinating puzzle. A dead man who continues to work, phantom footprints, and mysterious commissions from non-existent customers. When may we examine this scene of supernatural cobblery?" "At your earliest convenience, Holmes. The workshop remains sealed, though I confess the local constabulary are reluctant to venture there after dark. They speak of ghostly hammering that continues long after the premises have been secured. Holmes reached for his coat with the decisive movement that marked the beginning of a new investigation. "Then we shall visit Cobbler's Lane this very evening, Watson. It appears the phantom cobbler of Clerkenwell requires our immediate attention." The inspector had scarcely finished speaking when Holmes, who had been examining a peculiar stain upon his sleeve, with that intense concentration he reserved for the most minute details, suddenly looked up with eyes ablaze, with intellectual fervor. "One moment, Lestrade," he said, raising a long, pale finger. "You mentioned that Constable Pike heard these mysterious sounds at 5 minutes before midnight, yet the discovery was made at 10 minutes past the hour. That interval of 15 minutes, what transpired during that time?" "Pike waited and listened, Mr. Holmes, then fetched Constable Morrison before attempting entry. They are both experienced men, not given to flights of fancy." "Quite so. And the fastenings you described, the key turned in the lock from within, the bolt shot, and an awl wedged through the staple. Most methodical for a phantom, would you not agree, Watson?" Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a small leather case containing his most delicate instruments. "Tell me, Inspector, this commission book entry for E. Hexley was the ink of the same vintage as the earlier entries?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "I confess I had not thought to examine such details, Holmes." "No, in matter. We shall remedy that oversight presently." Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam of anticipation. "Your service revolver, Watson, and your medical bag. While I suspect our phantom will prove decidedly mortal upon examination, the circumstances suggest we may encounter dangers of a more earthly nature." Within minutes, we had descended to the fog-shrouded street, where a hansom waited in the amber glow of the gas lamps. As we settled into the leather seats, Holmes withdrew into that profound silence which invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. The clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones and the occasional cry of a night vendor provided the only sounds as we made our way through London's labyrinthine streets toward Clerkenwell. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured as the cab turned into narrower thoroughfares, "how the fog grows thicker as we approach our destination. Note also the subtle change in the very quality of the air, less coal smoke, tang of industrial processes. Clerkenwell has always been a district where honest craftsmen ply their trades, but it is also a place where more clandestine activities might flourish unobserved." The hansom deposited us at the mouth of a narrow passage, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast. Cobbler's Lane stretched before us like a dark throat, its overhanging eaves creating a tunnel of shadows that seemed to swallow the feeble light from a solitary gas lamp. The very atmosphere felt oppressive, heavy with the scent of leather, wax, and something else, a metallic tang that set my nerves on edge. Constable Pike emerged from the shadows, his usually robust Yorkshire demeanor notably subdued. "Mr. Holmes, sir," he said, touching his helmet respectfully. The sounds came again not an hour past that rhythmic tapping, steady as a heartbeat, and twice the bell gave a little chime, soft-like, as if touched by an unseen hand. Holmes examined the young constable with that penetrating gaze which seemed to catalogue every detail of a man's character and recent activities. "You have been on this beat for how long, Pike?" 3 years come Christmas, sir. "Never heard the like before old Grieve disappeared last spring. And you are certain these sounds originated from within the sealed workshop?" "Certain as death itself, Mr. Holmes. The buildings on either side house a milliner's establishment and a lodging house, both quiet as the grave after dark." As we approached the cobbler's workshop, Holmes produced a powerful bull's-eye lantern from beneath his coat. Its beam cut through the murky atmosphere to illuminate a narrow, 3-story building squeezed between its neighbors. The ground-floor windows were boarded, and the door bore Scotland Yard's official seal, though I noticed Holmes examining this seal with particular interest. "Most instructive," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass. "Lestrade, observe the slight discoloration here along the edge." And the wax has cracked in this distinctive pattern. Unless I am much mistaken, this seal has been disturbed and most carefully reapplied. The inspector stared at the seal with new eyes. But that would mean that our phantom possesses both considerable dexterity and intimate knowledge of official procedures. Holmes finished. Break the seal, if you please. Let us request an audience with the industrious spirit of Cobbler's Lane. As Lestrade's key turned in the lock, a faint sound drifted from within the soft, rhythmic tapping that had so unnerved the constables, steady and methodical, like a craftsman's hammer shaping leather with practiced precision. The moment Lestrade's key turned in the lock, the rhythmic tapping ceased with such abruptness that the silence seemed to press against our eardrums like a physical weight. Holmes raised his hand, motioning us to absolute stillness as he pressed his ear to the weathered door. The fog swirled around us in the narrow lane, and for nearly a minute we remained frozen, our breath forming ghostly plumes in the November air. Fascinating, Holmes whispered, his grey eyes reflecting the lantern light with an almost feverish intensity. The cessation was immediate, not the gradual trailing off one might expect from an echo or dying mechanism, but the instant silence of conscious awareness. Our phantom, it would seem, possesses remarkably acute hearing. The door yielded with a reluctant groan, admitting us into the stale atmosphere of the abandoned workshop. Holmes's bull's-eye lantern swept across the interior, revealing a scene frozen in time yet bearing unmistakable signs of recent disturbance. The mingled scents of leather, wax, and iron met us, but beneath these familiar odors lurked something else, a peculiar sweetness, almost floral, with a faint medicinal undertone that set my medical instincts on edge. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, directing the light toward the floor, behind the counter where a chalk outline marked poor Greaves' final position. "Note the undisturbed dust everywhere, save for this narrow pathway from the door to the workbench, and these most revealing impressions in the spilled cobbler's wax." The footprints were indeed extraordinary, small, delicately formed, and undeniably bare. Holmes dropped to one knee, examining them with his magnifying glass with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. "The prints of a woman," he announced, "though unusually small, perhaps a size 3 at most. Note the high arch, the absence of callousing that would suggest habitual barefoot walking, and most significantly, the weight distribution. This person removed her shoes deliberately for this particular visit." "But how did she enter and leave?" Lestrade demanded, his voice betraying his growing frustration. "The place was sealed tight as a tomb." Holmes rose and began his methodical examination of the workshop's perimeter. His keen eyes missed nothing as he tested floorboards, scrutinized walls, and examined the painted-over skylight with particular attention. Near the workbench, he paused at a loose section of skirting board. "The source of our phantom's industry," he said, producing his thin-bladed knife and carefully prying away a neat square of wood. A thread of cold air crept upward, carrying that same metallic tang we had noticed earlier. He lowered the lantern, revealing an ingenious mechanism hidden within the wall cavity. "Behold our supernatural cobbler," Holmes announced with evident satisfaction. A leather strap, drawn over a wooden peg, positioned beneath a pierced water pipe. As each drop strikes the strap, it gradually stretches until a counterweight falls, striking this cobbler's hammer against a metal plate. The weight's descent also triggers this fine gut line, which extends through the wall to activate the doorbell. Lestrade stared at the device in amazement. "But someone must wind it, set it running?" "Precisely. An hour's operation, perhaps 2, before requiring reset. Our phantom visits regularly to maintain the illusion." Holmes replaced the board with meticulous care, then moved to examine the tools scattered across the workbench. "Your medical opinion, Watson," he said, lifting a cobbler's hammer and holding it beneath the lantern light. "What do you make of this staining?" I accepted the tool with growing unease. The metal head showed dark discoloration that extended up the wooden handle. irregular patterns that spoke of recent, forceful use. "The staining appears organic," I said slowly, "and if I did not know better, I might suspect blood." Holmes finished quietly. "Recently shed and hastily cleaned, though not with complete thoroughness. This implement has served purposes far removed from honest cobblery." As if summoned by our discovery, a soft scratching emanated from the walls, not the mechanical tapping we had heard before, but something altogether more organic. The sound seemed to move, traveling along the timber framework of the old building. Holmes approached the back wall with renewed interest, his sensitive fingers exploring the wooden panels. "Inspector," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of triumph, "I believe our investigation has reached a most crucial juncture. The commission book, if you please." As Lestrade produced the leather-bound ledger, Holmes examined the final entry with his magnifying glass. The handwriting maintains Greaves' characteristics, yet observe the subtle tremor in the formation of certain letters. This was written under considerable duress, or by someone making a deliberate effort to copy his hand. The scratching sound intensified, and with it came a stronger waft of that mysterious floral scent. Holmes closed the lantern abruptly, plunging us into darkness. "We leave everything precisely as we found it," he whispered urgently. "Inspector, arrange a discreet watch. No uniforms, no disturbance. Pike at the milliner's corner will suffice. Whoever maintains that mechanical phantom will return to judge its effect, and when they do, we shall be waiting." The following morning arrived with the great, persistent drizzle that transforms London's cobblestones into mirrors, reflecting the city's restless energy. I had barely finished my morning correspondence when the familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade echoed upon our stairs, though his usual measured pace carried an unmistakable note of triumph that immediately caught Holmes's attention. "Gentlemen," Lestrade announced as he entered our sitting room, his weathered face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has untangled a particularly complex knot, "I bring news that will put our phantom cobbler to rest once and for all." Holmes looked up from his morning examination of tobacco ash samples, his grey eyes showing that peculiar mixture of interest and skepticism that invariably preceded his most penetrating observations. "Indeed, Inspector, your confidence suggests you have discovered something of considerable significance." "More than significant," Holmes conclusive. Lestrade settled into his customary chair beside our fire, producing a small leather satchel with the flourish of a magician, revealing his final trick. "We have identified our culprit, and he is no phantom at all, but a flesh-and-blood scoundrel named Thomas Finch." The name struck a chord of recognition, and I saw Holmes's aquiline features sharpen with interest. "Finch," he murmured thoughtfully. "If memory serves, he was once employed by the late Silas Greaves." "Precisely," Lestrade exclaimed, clearly pleased that Holmes had recalled the connection. "Finch served as Greaves' apprentice for nearly 3 years, until his dismissal last spring, under circumstances that can only be described as acrimonious. According to witnesses at the Lamb and Flag public house, there was a heated confrontation between master and apprentice, with Finch making threats that were overheard by no fewer than 6 patrons. Holmes began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace, his movements betraying the restless energy that always accompanied his consideration of new evidence. "The nature of these threats, Inspector," Finch declared, and I quote the testimony of one Mrs. Pemberton from the milliner's establishment, that old Greaves would rue the day he cast him out, and that the cobbler would find his own shoes pinching before the matter was settled. Lestrade paused dramatically, rather prophetic, considering recent events. From his satchel, the inspector produced a pair of ladies' boots, their black leather gleaming despite obvious signs of recent completion. These were discovered in Finch's lodgings, not 12 hours past, hidden beneath loose floorboards in a manner that suggests considerable guilt. The workmanship is unmistakably Greaves' note, the distinctive stitching pattern, and the particular curve of the heel that was his signature. I examined the boots with growing interest, noting the quality of the leather and the precise craftsmanship that spoke of years of dedicated practice. "They appear to have been completed very recently," I observed. "The leather still carries the scent of fresh wax and dressing." "Exactly, Watson." Lestrade's satisfaction was evident. "Which brings us to the most damning evidence of all. These boots match precisely the commission entry we discovered in Greaves' ledger, the order placed by 1E. Hexley for delivery this week. Finch has been using his master's workshop to complete unfinished orders, no doubt intending to profit from work that was rightfully Greaves'." Holmes paused in his perambulations, accepting the boots from my hands and examining them with that intense concentration he reserved for the most crucial pieces of evidence. His long, sensitive fingers traced the stitching patterns, tested the flexibility of the leather, and examined the construction with the thoroughness of a master craftsman evaluating a colleague's work. "The case becomes clearer by the moment," Lestrade continued, warming to his theme. "Finch possessed both motive and opportunity. He knew the workshop intimately, having worked there for years. He would have retained a key from his apprenticeship, explaining how he gained entry to the sealed premises. His small stature would account for the diminutive footprints we discovered, and his familiarity with cobbling tools explains the blood-stained hammer." "You have been most thorough, Inspector," Holmes said quietly, though I detected a subtle note in his voice that suggested his thoughts were moving in directions that Lestrade had not yet considered. "Tell me, where did you apprehend this Thomas Finch?" "At the Anchor Tavern in Whitechapel, attempting to sell these very boots to a fence known for handling stolen goods. When confronted, he claimed they were his own work, completed in his private workshop. However, he could produce no evidence of such a workshop, nor explain how he had acquired leather of such superior quality." Holmes returned the boots to Lestrade with movements that seemed almost dismissive, though his eyes remained fixed upon them with unwavering intensity. "The evidence you present, Inspector, forms a most compelling narrative. The disgruntled apprentice, the heated confrontation, the mysterious key, the recently completed work, each element supports the others with remarkable consistency." "Indeed it does," Lestrade beamed, clearly interpreting Holmes's words as endorsement of his conclusions. "A straightforward case of murder motivated by revenge and profit. Finch killed his former master, then used the workshop to complete valuable commissions, creating the phantom Cobbler illusion to discourage investigation." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the grey London morning, with an expression that had grown increasingly thoughtful. "Tell me, Inspector, in your experience, how often do the most serious crimes present themselves with such convenient clarity?" Lestrade's confident expression wavered slightly. "I'm not certain I follow your meaning, Holmes. Consider the sequence of events," Holmes continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I knew so well. "A man commits murder, then continues to use the victim's workshop for his own profit. Yet rather than working in secret, he creates an elaborate mechanical device designed to attract attention. He leaves clear footprints, abandons blood-stained tools, and is discovered attempting to sell the evidence of his crimes in a public establishment frequented by known criminals." The inspector's face showed growing confusion. Perhaps Finch is simply not as clever as he believed himself to be. Holmes turned from the window, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar light that always appeared when his mind had detected some fundamental inconsistency in the apparent facts. "Perhaps, Inspector. Number 4. Or perhaps someone has gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Thomas Finch appears guilty of crimes he did not commit." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of our fire and the distant sounds of London's morning traffic. Lestrade stared at Holmes with the expression of a man who had believed himself on solid ground, only to discover quicksand beneath his feet. "You believe Finch is innocent?" I asked, though Holmes's manner had already suggested the direction of his thoughts. "I believe, Watson, that when a case presents itself with such perfect clarity, such convenient resolution of all apparent mysteries, it deserves the most suspicious examination. His movements now betraying the restless energy that always accompanied his greatest intellectual challenges. Our phantom cobbler has proven most accommodating in providing us with a suitable culprit. The question that intrigues me is why someone wishes Thomas Finch to hang for crimes he did not commit. Lestrade's weathered features bore the unmistakable expression of a man who believed he had successfully untangled the most perplexing of mysteries. He settled back in his chair with evident satisfaction, clearly expecting Holmes to acknowledge the brilliance of his deductive work. "The evidence speaks with perfect clarity, Holmes," the inspector continued, his voice carrying that note of professional triumph that marked his most confident moments. "Thomas Finch possessed both motive and opportunity, and we have found him in possession of goods that could only have been completed in the deceased's workshop." Holmes, however, had begun that restless pacing which invariably accompanied his most intense periods of mental activity. "Precisely what troubles me, Inspector," he replied, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar light which appeared when his mind detected fundamental inconsistencies in apparently straightforward cases. "In my considerable experience, genuine criminals rarely provide such convenient trails of incriminating evidence. The November drizzle had intensified outside our Baker Street windows, transforming London's familiar streets into a maze of grey shadows and reflected gaslight. Yet Holmes seemed energized rather than dampened by the gloomy weather, as if the atmospheric conditions matched perfectly with the murky complexities of our current investigation. "Come, Watson," Holmes announced suddenly, reaching for his coat with that decisive movement that marked the beginning of serious investigative work. "Inspector Lestrade, if you would be so kind as to arrange for us to interview the accused at Bow Street, I believe a personal examination of Miss Finch may prove most illuminating." Within the hour, we found ourselves in the austere confines of Bow Street Police Station, where Thomas Finch sat upon a wooden bench, his wrists secured by iron manacles, yet his demeanor suggesting resignation rather than guilt. He was a slight man of perhaps 25 years, with the quick, intelligent hands that marked his cobbling trade and eyes that held more bewilderment than fear. "Mr. Finch," Holmes began with that deceptively conversational tone he employed during his most crucial interrogations, "you served as apprentice to Silas Grieve for 3 years before your dismissal last spring. Show me your hands, if you please." The young man raised his manacled hands with obvious confusion, allowing Holmes to examine them with the thoroughness of a physician conducting a medical assessment. Holmes studied the fingers, thumbs, and particularly the nail beds with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "The calluses and scars are consistent with years of cobbling work," Holmes observed. "Yet your fingernails have been recently cleaned unusually so for a man apprehended in a tavern. And here, Watson, observe this violet-tinted residue beneath the cuticles." I examined the faint discoloration, Holmes indicated, noting its unusual hue. "Face powder, perhaps?" "Precisely. Most curious for a man of Finch's circumstances and recent activities." Holmes stepped back, his penetrating gaze fixed upon our prisoner. "Tell me, Finch, did you kill Silas Grieve?" "No, sir," the man replied with evident sincerity, his voice hoarse but steady. "Master Grieve dismissed me and kept wages that were rightfully mine, but I never raised a hand against him. I visited the lane twice in recent weeks, hoping to recover my belongings, but the police seals prevented entry." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then produced the lady's boots from Lestrade's evidence bag. "When did you last work on these particular boots?" Finch examined them carefully, his trained eye noting details that would escape casual observation. "I remember stitching the uppers months ago when I still worked for Master Grieve, but the finishing work is not mine. The heel breast is cut too close, and the pegging turns leftward, not my technique." This technical assessment clearly impressed Holmes, who examined the boots with renewed interest through his magnifying glass. The stitching pattern varies from 7 to 8 per inch, he murmured to me, and the waxed thread ends are rolled clockwise. Grieve, being right-handed, would have rolled them in the opposite direction. Our return to Cobbler's Lane revealed the narrow passage shrouded in afternoon mist, the overhanging eaves, creating tunnels of shadow that seemed to swallow what little light penetrated the grey sky. Holmes moved through the workshop with renewed purpose, his examination more methodical than before, his attention focused on details that had escaped our previous investigation. Near the chalk outline marking Grieve's final position, Holmes knelt and examined the underside of the counter with particular care. Using tweezers from his instrument case, he extracted a tiny fragment of dark, brittle material embedded in the rough wood. A splinter of some sort, I observed as he placed it carefully in a clean handkerchief. Indeed, Watson, though its significance may prove greater than its size suggests. Holmes then turned his attention to the commission book, producing a small, portable microscope to examine both the ink and paper of the final entry. After several minutes of intense scrutiny, a subtle change came over his features. The barely perceptible tightening that indicated a crucial discovery. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hudson's boy with a calling card. Holmes examined it with evident interest before instructing that the visitor be shown up immediately. Miss Eleanor Hexley, he announced to Lestrade, whose face registered immediate recognition of the name from the commission book. The lady who entered our makeshift interview room bore all the hallmarks of genteel poverty, well-made clothing, showing careful mending, gloves turned to conceal wear, and boots polished to disguise their age. She possessed that particular composure that marks those who have learned to navigate society's challenges through dignity and careful observation. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her refined voice carrying genuine distress, "I have come regarding the dreadful business in Cobbler's Lane. I understand there has been some confusion regarding a commission allegedly placed in my name." Holmes gestured for her to be seated, his manner unusually gentle. "Indeed, Miss Hexley, perhaps you could clarify the circumstances surrounding your supposed order for ladies' boots?" "I placed no such commission, Mr. Holmes. I had never heard of Mr. Grieve until the newspapers reported his tragic discovery. However, 3 days ago I received a package containing exquisite ladies' boots, along with a demand for payment of £3, 10 shillings. The same boots currently in Inspector Lestrade's possession? I cannot say with certainty, as I returned them immediately with a firm letter explaining that no such order had been placed. Yesterday evening, however, I received a most disturbing visit from 2 men claiming to represent Mr. Grieve's estate." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "These gentlemen, did they provide credentials?" "They claimed to be solicitors, though their manner suggested otherwise. One was large and coarse-featured, more laborer than legal professional. The other was smaller, well-dressed, but with calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue every item in my modest sitting room." "And their specific demands?" Miss Hexley's composure wavered slightly. "They claimed I owed nearly £20 for various commissions, threatening legal action and suggesting my reputation would suffer if word spread that I refused to honor legitimate debts." Holmes had resumed his pacing, his movements betraying intense mental activity. "Miss Hexley, do you possess any connection to Thomas Finch?" "I have never heard that name before today, Mr. Holmes." "Then someone has chosen you quite deliberately for reasons we have yet to understand." Holmes turned to Lestrade with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Inspector, I fear your case against Thomas Finch has become significantly more complicated. We are dealing not with a simple murder motivated by revenge, but with an elaborate scheme designed to frame an innocent man while concealing the true perpetrator's identity and motives." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady patter of rain against the workshop's boarded windows and the distant sounds of London's evening traffic. Lestrade stared at Holmes with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed theory dissolve before his eyes, while Miss Hexley looked between us with growing understanding that she had become an unwitting participant in a conspiracy of considerable complexity. The phantom cobbler, Holmes, who concluded quietly, has proven most accommodating in providing us with a suitable culprit. Our task now is to determine why someone wishes Thomas Finch to hang for crimes he did not commit, and what deeper game is being played in the shadows of Cobbler's Lane. Miss Hexley's revelation had scarcely concluded when Holmes moved with characteristic decisiveness to his chemical apparatus, producing the dark fragment he had extracted from beneath Greaves' counter. The November rain continued its steady percussion against our windows as he subjected the material to careful analysis, his long fingers working with the precision of a master chemist. "Most illuminating," he murmured, holding the fragment over a spirit flame. A faint, sweet vapor arose, not the expected scent of burning wood, but something altogether more complex. Orris root and shellac, Watson, combined with traces of a mineral compound that suggests this splinter originated not from furniture or flooring, but from a walking stick treated with decorative lacquer. Inspector Lestrade leaned forward with renewed interest. "The walking stick of one of Miss Hexley's mysterious visitors, perhaps?" "Precisely what I suspect, Inspector. And observe this violet residue more closely." Holmes produced a small sample of the powder we had discovered beneath Thomas Finch's fingernails, subjecting it to similar analysis. Not face powder, as we initially supposed, but powdered orris root, a substance commonly employed in the millinery trade to impart a fashionable scent to goods of inferior quality. The implications struck me immediately. The milliner's establishment adjacent to Greaves' workshop, Mrs. Pemberton's shop. "Indeed, Watson, the proximity is hardly coincidental." Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his grey eyes reflecting that intense concentration which marked his most crucial deductions. "Consider the sequence of events. Greaves disappears last spring. His workshop is sealed, yet phantom activities continue to emanate from the premises. Meanwhile, the neighboring millinery maintains normal business operations, providing perfect cover for clandestine access." Miss Hexley, who had been following our discussion with growing comprehension, spoke quietly. "You believe, Mrs. Nartoon, Pemberton is involved in this conspiracy?" "Not willingly, I suspect," Holmes replied, his voice carrying a note of concern that was unusual for him. "The violet residue beneath Finch's nails suggests he has been in recent contact with someone from the millinery trade, someone who may have provided information or assistance under duress." Holmes moved to examine the commission book once more, this time with his powerful magnifying glass focused on the paper itself rather than the ink. "Watson, observe the watermark, a distinctive pattern that suggests paper of superior quality, far exceeding what a humble cobbler would typically employ for his business records." I examined the faint pattern visible when the page was held to the light. It appears to be a manufacturer's mark of some sophistication. "Precisely. This paper originated from a stationer's establishment, catering to professional clientele, solicitors, perhaps, or other individuals requiring documents of apparent legitimacy." Holmes set down the magnifying glass with evident satisfaction. "Our phantom cobbler has gone to considerable expense to create convincing forgeries." The sound of approaching footsteps on our stairs interrupted our analysis. "Mrs. Hudson's voice called up that Constable Pike awaited below with urgent news. Within moments, the young officer appeared, his usually composed demeanor notably agitated. "Mr. Holmes, sir," Pike began breathlessly. "Mrs. Pemberton from the millinery has been found unconscious in her shop. The surgeon believes she was overcome by some form of vapor chloroform, perhaps, though he notes an unusual floral undertone to the substance." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "The orris root compound, Watson. Someone has silenced a potential witness." He turned to Pike with sharp attention. "The circumstances of her discovery, Constable?" "The shop appeared undisturbed from the front, sir, but the rear door, the one that adjoins Greaves' workshop, had been forced. We found Mrs. Pemberton behind her counter, clutching this. Pike produced a small object wrapped in his handkerchief. Holmes unwrapped it to reveal an intricately carved wooden thimble, its surface polished to a deep luster and bearing minute engravings that spoke of considerable craftsmanship. A sewing implement of unusual quality, he observed, examining it through his lens. Yet Mrs. Pemberton deals primarily in finished millinery, not the fine needlework that would require such a tool. Then, it was left deliberately, I suggested, perhaps as a message or warning, or as evidence of the true nature of the business conducted in these adjacent premises. Holmes wrapped the thimble carefully and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. Inspector Lestrade, I believe the time has come for a more thorough examination of the connection between these establishments. The Phantom Cobbler's activities extend far beyond simple fraud or revenge. As if summoned by Holmes's words, a soft tapping resumed from the direction of Cobbler's Lane, not the mechanical rhythm we had heard before, but something more irregular, almost urgent. Holmes moved to the window, peering into the fog-shrouded street with an expression that had grown increasingly grim. "Our adversaries grow bold," he said quietly. "They believe their frame of Thomas Finch will satisfy our investigation, yet they continue their clandestine activities with increasing desperation. Watson, I fear we have stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple murder motivated by revenge. The Phantom Cobbler serves as mere camouflage for an enterprise of considerably darker purpose." The tapping ceased, abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain and the distant rumble of London's evening traffic. Yet Holmes remained at the window, his keen gaze fixed upon the shadows of Baker Street, as if expecting the emergence of some sinister figure from the November gloom. "Come," he said suddenly, reaching for his coat. "Mrs. Pemberton may yet provide crucial testimony, and I suspect our phantom grows increasingly desperate to prevent such revelations. The game, as they say, is afoot, and I fear the stakes have risen considerably beyond our initial estimation." Our hansom clattered through the fog-shrouded streets toward Clerkenwell with urgent purpose, the November evening having transformed London into a maze of amber gaslight and shifting shadows. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his aquiline features sharp with concentration as he examined the carved thimble through his magnifying glass, the intricate engravings catching what little light penetrated the cab's interior. "Craftsmanship speaks of specialized training," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the clip-clop of hooves on wet cobblestones. "Yet Mrs. Pemberton deals in ready-made millinery, not fine needlework requiring such implements. Someone has been conducting activities in her premises that extend far beyond the simple sale of bonnets and gloves." We found Mrs. Pemberton conscious but pale, propped upon a cot in the rear room of her establishment. The surgeon confirmed Holmes's suspicions regarding the chloroform, noting the unusual floral undertone that masked the chemical's harsh scent. Her testimony, delivered in whispered fragments, proved illuminating. "2 men," she managed, her voice hoarse from the chemical's effects. One rough as a dray horse, reeking of gin and tar. The other smaller, well-spoken, with a polished cane that tapped against my tiles. Called himself Mortlake, claimed to represent Greaves' estate. Never showed papers properly, just a flash. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest. "Their access to Greaves' workshop?" Her trembling hand indicated a curtained alcove. "The old cupboard backs to his storeroom. They forced me to keep it unbolted, said it was for deliveries. I heard that dreadful hammering at all hours." Holmes crossed to the alcove with purposeful strides. The cupboard appeared ordinary, fitted for hat boxes, yet his keen examination revealed the rear panel's secret. A gentle pressure caused it to swing inward, revealing a narrow passage that connected directly to Greaves' workshop. Cool air drifted through, carrying that familiar metallic tang. "Our Phantom's method of entry," Holmes announced with satisfaction. "Mrs. Pemberton, You mentioned subscriptions and accounts. What precisely did Mortlake demand? He spoke of respectable ladies who had entered arrangements for goods, she whispered, her distress evident. Said if they complained, he would hint at indiscretions. The names were in his pocketbook, a ledger of some sort. Holmes's expression hardened. Fraudulent commissions designed to extort payment through implied scandal, and when legitimate tradespeople protested, their premises became corridors for more serious crimes. Returning to examine the thimble more closely, Holmes pressed against a minute seam near its rim. The top unscrewed with the faintest click, revealing a hollow interior containing a tiny steel cylinder. When pressed to warmed sealing wax, it left a crisp impression, a capital M entwined with laurel spray. A private seal, Holmes observed, suggesting our Mr. Mortlake operates with considerable organization and forethought. Inspector Lestrade, who had been examining the forced rear door, called our attention to additional evidence. Hidden beneath loose floorboards near the passage entrance, we discovered bottles of various inks, papers bearing different watermarks, and, most significantly, practice sheets showing repeated attempts to forge, and handwriting including multiple efforts to replicate Silas Greaves' distinctive script. A forger's workshop, Holmes declared, operated under the cover of legitimate millinery. But observe this document, Inspector. The paper bore an official seal and Scotland Yard letterhead, a warrant for Thomas Finch's arrest, dated 3 days before Greaves' body had been discovered. Lestrade stared at it in bewilderment. "Impossible," he stammered. "No such warrant was issued." Precisely. Someone possessed detailed knowledge of the crimes before their official discovery and prepared documentation ensuring Finch's conviction. We are dealing with a conspiracy of considerable sophistication. As evening deepened into night, Holmes outlined his strategy. Our adversaries believe their frame of Thomas Finch will satisfy our investigation. We shall encourage this belief by spreading word that Mrs. Pemberton's condition prevents testimony and that the case against Finch remains solid. Meanwhile, we position ourselves to observe their next move. Holmes arranged for discreet surveillance of the premises while creating the impression that official interest had waned. They will return, he predicted, confident in their success and eager to resume their clandestine operations. The phantom cobbler served as camouflage, but the true enterprise extends far beyond simple fraud. As midnight approached, the fog thickened around Cobbler's Lane, muffling sounds and creating pools of shadow between the feeble gas lamps. From our concealed position within the millinery, we maintained watch through the hidden passage, waiting for the inevitable return of those who had orchestrated this elaborate deception. The rhythmic tapping that had given the phantom cobbler its supernatural reputation began anew, steady and methodical, echoing through the narrow lane. But tonight, Holmes's trap was set, and the hunters had become the hunted. "Patience, Watson," Holmes whispered as footsteps approached through the fog. "Our phantom is about to shed its ghostly guise and reveal the very mortal malice beneath." The mechanical tapping resumed its steady rhythm as we maintained our vigil within Mrs. Pemberton's millinery, the sound echoing through the concealed passage with clockwork precision. Holmes crouched beside me in absolute stillness, his grey eyes reflecting the faint gaslight that penetrated the fog-shrouded lane. The November mist had grown so dense that even the familiar sounds of London's restless night seemed muffled and distant, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly isolation. At precisely 20 minutes past midnight, the rhythmic hammering ceased with that abrupt finality we had observed before. Holmes raised his hand in warning as footsteps approached through the narrow passage, not the measured tread of a constable making his rounds, but the cautious, deliberate movement of individuals intimately familiar with these premises and their clandestine purposes. A key turned in the workshop's front lock with practiced ease, followed by the soft scraping of bolts being withdrawn. The door yielded to admit two figures whose forms were barely visible in the murky atmosphere. The first was indeed the large, coarse-featured man Mrs. Pemberton had described, his movements suggesting the brute strength of a dock laborer. Behind him came the smaller figure we had been expecting, well-dressed despite the hour, and carrying the polished walking stick that had left its telltale splinter beneath Greaves' counter. Mortlake, Holmes breathed almost inaudibly, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction as his quarry finally revealed himself. The smaller man produced a bullseye lantern, its beam cutting through the workshop's stale atmosphere to illuminate the mechanical device Holmes had discovered during our earlier investigation. With practiced efficiency that spoke of frequent repetition, he began resetting the apparatus, while his burly companion moved to examine the chalk outline where poor Greaves' body had been discovered. "The authorities have accepted our narrative completely," Mortlake said in cultured tones that contrasted sharply with his clandestine activities. His voice carried the educated accent of a man who had once moved in respectable society. "Inspector Lestrade believes Thomas Finch guilty beyond question, and the newspapers have proclaimed the phantom Cobbler mystery solved to their satisfaction." His companion, whose rough accent betrayed origins in London's less refined districts, grunted his approval. "What of the milliner woman? She witnessed too much of our comings and goings. Mrs. Pemberton's memory has been sufficiently affected by the chloroform to prevent coherent testimony," Mortlake replied with callous satisfaction. "By the time she regains full faculties, Thomas Finch will have faced the gallows, and our operations can resume without further interference from meddling investigators." Holmes's jaw tightened at these cold-blooded words, but he remained motionless as Mortlake moved to examine a hidden compartment beneath the main workbench. His lantern revealed materials that bore no relation to honest cobblery bottles of various chemicals, sheets of high-quality paper bearing official watermarks, and, most significantly, engraving plates bearing the seals and letterheads of numerous government departments. "The counterfeiting operation continues as planned," Mortlake continued with evident professional pride. "Warrants, certificates, bills of exchange, letters of credit. We have created documents that have deceived the most experienced officials. The phantom cobbler served admirably as camouflage, but our real profits derive from providing new identities and false credentials to those willing to pay handsomely for such services." The scope of the conspiracy became clear as Holmes absorbed these revelations. This was no simple murder, motivated by revenge, but headquarters for a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been using the abandoned workshop to forge official documents on an unprecedented scale. The larger man began loading printing materials into leather satchels with methodical precision. The other locations we prepared: the vacant bindery near London Bridge, the abandoned premises in Bermondsey, all secured and equipped, Mortlake confirmed. "We relocate operations immediately. These premises have served their purpose, and Finch's execution will close this chapter permanently." Mortlake paused to examine something that had caught his attention, a subtle disturbance in the dust patterns near our concealed passage. Holmes tensed, recognizing the critical moment when observation might transform into dangerous confrontation. "Someone has been here recently," Mortlake observed quietly, his educated voice carrying a new note of suspicion. "The dust has been disturbed, and there are traces of fresh footprints near the rear wall." His companion immediately moved toward the passage entrance, his massive frame blocking our view as he examined the concealed door with growing alarm. "The milliner's entrance," he announced grimly. "Someone has discovered our method of access." Mortlake's response was swift and decisive. "Then our departure becomes urgent. Gather everything, leave nothing that could connect us to these premises or our broader operations." This was our moment. Holmes signaled silently, then moved with characteristic swiftness through the concealed passage and into the workshop. "Good evening, gentlemen." His voice cut through the stale air with crisp authority. "I trust you are finding your nocturnal activities profitable." The larger man dropped his satchel with a clatter of bottles and metal plates, his eyes wide with shock and growing fear. Mortlake spun from his position near the workbench, his hand instinctively moving toward the coat's inner pocket. "Sherlock Holmes," our detective announced as Lestrade and I emerged from concealment, "and I find your definition of honest business rather expansive. You have several questions to answer regarding Silas Grieve, Thomas Finch, and Mrs. Pemberton." The burly accomplice lunged forward with a roar of desperation, but Lestrade intercepted him with a well-aimed blow from his truncheon that sent the man staggering against the workbench. Mortlake had produced a small pistol, but Holmes was already upon him, seizing his wrist with iron strength and twisting the weapon from his grasp with practiced efficiency. "Most unsporting, Mr. Mortlake," Holmes observed as both criminals found themselves secured in manacles. "Though I confess your choice of blank cartridges suggests you preferred intimidation to actual violence, a revealing detail about your true character." Among the abandoned materials, Holmes discovered a leather-bound ledger containing names, addresses, and, beside each entry, some compromising detail sufficient to ensure silence or extort payment. The scope of their blackmail operation extended far beyond simple document forgery. "The game reaches its climax, Watson," Holmes announced with satisfaction as he examined engraving plates bearing the distinctive laurel-wreathed M we had discovered earlier. "Our phantom cobbler has revealed not only his mortal nature, but the full extent of his criminal enterprise. Tomorrow, we shall trace these operations to their source and ensure that justice prevails for both the innocent and the guilty." The fog pressed against the workshop windows like a living thing as we secured the evidence that would finally bring truth to light in the mysterious case of Cobbler's Lane. The fog pressed against the workshop windows like a living shroud as Holmes began his methodical examination of the evidence scattered throughout Mortlake's clandestine operation. With both criminals secured in manacles, the detective's grey eyes reflected that peculiar intensity which marked his most triumphant moments of deduction. "Observe, Inspector," Holmes began, his long finger tracing the air above the chalk outline where poor Grieve had been discovered. "How perfectly this conspiracy was designed to satisfy our desire for logical resolution. Yet when examined closely, the very perfection of the evidence against Thomas Finch reveals its artificial nature." He moved to the mechanical device hidden within the wall cavity, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I knew so well. This ingenious contraption, a leather strap, wooden peg, and counterweight system triggered by dripping water, served multiple purposes. The rhythmic tapping provided supernatural camouflage for printing presses and engraving work, while the intermittent bell chime suggested ghostly presence to discourage investigation. Lestrade examined the device with growing comprehension, but someone had to reset it regularly. "Precisely, Inspector. Mr. Mortlake's frequent visits through Mrs. Pemberton's adjoining premises allowed him to maintain the illusion while conducting his true business, the systematic forgery of official documents and the blackmail of respectable citizens." Holmes produced the fragment of lacquered wood he had discovered beneath the counter. This splinter from Mortlake's walking stick, embedded during his victim's final moments, provides physical evidence linking him directly to the scene. But observe this crucial detail. The victim was not murdered 6 months ago when Grieve supposedly disappeared. The detective's keen gaze fixed upon Mortlake, whose educated demeanor had given way to sullen resignation. Silas Grieve died of natural causes. Likely a sudden heart attack brought on by the terror of discovering his premises had been invaded by criminals. His body, undiscovered for weeks, provided Mortlake with an unexpected opportunity. Rather than report the death and risk investigation, Holmes continued, Mortlake preserved the corpse and created an elaborate frame designed to implicate the most convenient suspect, the dismissed apprentice with documented grievances against his former master. From the evidence scattered across the workbench, Holmes selected the forged commission book entry. Note the subtle tremor in the handwriting, not Grieve's natural script, but a careful forgery executed under pressure. The paper itself bears watermarks far superior to what a humble cobbler would employ, suggesting procurement from a stationer serving professional clientele. He turned to address Harker, whose rough features showed growing fear. The orris root powder we discovered beneath Thomas Finch's fingernails came from Mrs. Pemberton's millinery, where your operation had forced entry. When Finch visited seeking information about his former master, he unknowingly acquired trace evidence that would later support your frame. The boots, discovered in Finch's possession. Holmes continued, examining the evidence with his magnifying glass, were indeed begun by his hand months ago. However, the finishing work, note the leftward pegging and clockwise rolled thread, ends, betrays different craftsmanship. Grieve, being right-handed, would have worked in the opposite direction. Inspector Lestrade studied the forged warrant, bearing his department's letterhead with evident disgust. The audacity is breathtaking, Holmes. They prepared evidence of Finch's guilt before arranging the discovery of the body. Because they orchestrated every aspect of the revelation, Holmes replied grimly. The timing of Constable Pike's patrol, the positioning of evidence, even the supernatural aspects designed to discourage thorough investigation, all calculated to ensure Thomas Finch would hang for crimes he did not commit. Holmes opened Mortlake's leather-bound ledger, revealing pages of names and cryptic notations. Scope of their enterprise, not simple murder, but systematic blackmail. Respectable ladies from prominent families, each entry noting some indiscretion or secret that could be exploited. The forged commissions served as pretexts for extortion, with threats of scandal ensuring compliance. The carved thimble with its hidden seal provided the final piece of evidence. This surrounded by laurel spray, appears on numerous forged documents. Pemberton clutched it during her assault, perhaps attempting to leave a clue, or perhaps Mortlake dropped it during his desperate attempt to silence a witness. As dawn approached, pale light began to penetrate the workshop's grimy atmosphere. Holmes surveyed the dismantled criminal enterprise with satisfaction. The phantom cobbler has been revealed as a most mortal creature, human greed masked by supernatural theater. Thomas Finch awaits vindication, while the true perpetrators of this elaborate deception face justice. Come, Watson, he concluded, reaching for his coat as additional constables arrived to secure the evidence. We have other premises to investigate. Mortlake mentioned locations near London Bridge and in Bermondsey. This conspiracy extends far beyond Cobbler's Lane, and we must ensure that every thread of this web is properly untangled. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the narrow passage in grey morning light as we prepared to conclude our investigation into one of the most ingeniously constructed criminal conspiracies we had yet encountered. The fog began to lift as the first pale light of dawn crept through the grimy windows of the workshop, revealing the full extent of Mortlake's criminal enterprise in stark detail. Holmes moved through the scattered evidence with methodical precision, his keen eyes cataloguing each piece of the elaborate puzzle that had so nearly claimed an innocent man's life. Observe, Watson, he said, holding up a sheet of the superior watermarked paper we had, and discovered how Mortlake's own materials become the instruments of his undoing. Inspector Lestrade, if you would be so kind as to provide me with sealing wax and your official stamp. With practiced efficiency, Holmes composed a brief message using Mortlake's own supplies. Move plates and paper to Bermondsey by 4. Finch secured. Milliner silenced. He pressed the carved thimble's hidden seal into the warm wax, creating a perfect impression of the laurel-wreathed M that had appeared on so many forged documents. Constable Pike, Holmes instructed. Deliver this to the vacant bindery near London Bridge. Place it beneath the loose windowsill on the eastern wall, then withdraw to observe. I suspect we shall flush additional conspirators from their hiding places within the hour. The trap proved devastatingly effective. By 10 minutes past the appointed hour, 3 figures had entered the bindery. 2 men and a woman carrying a portmanteau whose weight suggested printing plates and engraving tools. They found instead a semicircle of plainclothes officers with Holmes at their center, his grey eyes reflecting that cold courtesy which most unsettled the criminal mind. Our subsequent investigation of the Bermondsey premises revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Hidden above a vinegar yard whose acrid fumes could mask any number of chemical vapors, we discovered printing presses, engraving equipment, and stores of official papers that represented an investment of hundreds of pounds. This was no hastily assembled operation, but a carefully planned enterprise requiring substantial financial backing and technical expertise. The phantom cobbler served as mere camouflage, Holmes explained as we examined copper plates bearing the official seals of numerous government departments. While London whispered of supernatural hammering in Cobbler's Lane, Mortlake conducted a systematic assault upon the very foundations of official documentation. Warrants, certificates, letters of credit, diplomatic passports, he possessed the means to create any credential required to advance his purposes. The discovery of Mortlake's client ledger proved most illuminating. Names that would be recognized in the finest drawing rooms of Mayfair appeared alongside notations of gambling debts, romantic indiscretions, and political embarrassments. The phantom cobbler's supernatural theater had provided perfect camouflage for blackmail operations that reached into the highest levels of society. Holmes's investigation extended to the record office at Scotland Yard, where a clerk named Cribbins was discovered to have provided the templates for official seals in exchange for ready payment. Confronted with wafer-thin pencil rubbings hidden in his desk and a list of mislaid blank forms, the wretched fellow confessed immediately to months of quiet treachery. Meanwhile, the medical examination of poor Silas Grieve confirmed Holmes's deductions regarding the true cause of death. Under my professional supervision, we established clear evidence of fatty degeneration of the heart with no signs of violence. The cobbler had died of natural causes, likely a sudden attack brought on by the terror of discovering criminals in his workshop. Grieve surprised them during their preparations, Holmes observed quietly. And his own frailty completed what fear had begun. Mortlake then transformed an unfortunate death into an elaborate opportunity for framing an innocent man. The mystery of the small, bare footprints found its resolution in a frightened seamstress named Lena Baines, whom we discovered in lodgings near Saffron Hill. The 17-year-old girl, who carried the faint scent of orris and sizing, admitted to being brought at night by Harker to reset the mechanical device and transport finished forgeries through Mrs. Pemberton's adjoining premises. Her shoes had been removed to prevent marking the cobbler's wax with nail impressions that might betray the deception. Holmes's manner with the girl was singularly gentle. "Courage, child," he said, arranging with Lestrade that she be treated as a witness rather than a criminal. "You have been as much a victim of this conspiracy as Thomas Finch himself." By evening, our Baker Street sitting room had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom. Inspector Lestrade sat with the chastened expression of a man who had learned painful lessons about the dangers of accepting convenient explanations. Miss Eleanor Hexley occupied Mrs. Hudson's best chair, her composed demeanor masking the relief of vindication. Thomas Finch stood by our fireplace, still incredulous at his liberation from the gallows, twisting his cap in hands that bore the honest calluses of his trade. Holmes, assuming that dry, unemotional tone which always accompanied his most brilliant expositions, began his final summation. The phantom cobbler required a craftsman's ear to recognize as mechanical rather than spectral. The sealed door demanded knowledge of official procedures to break and restore without detection. The commission book's final entry, though executed in Grieve's hand, betrayed forgery through its superior paper and the subtle tremor in certain letters. He turned to address Thomas Finch directly. "The violet powder discovered beneath your fingernails came not from personal vanity, but from orris root, used in the millinery trade, acquired during an innocent visit to Mrs. Pemberton's establishment while seeking information about your former master. This trace evidence later served our conspirators by supporting their elaborate frame. The blood-stained hammer, Holmes continued, bore not the residue of murder but Harker's own blood, renewed when Inspector Lestrade's persuasive truncheon reopened already bruised knuckles during the arrest. The laurel-wreathed seal linked forged documents directly to their creator, while the lacquer splinter beneath Greaves' counter placed Mortlake himself at the scene during the victim's final moments. Holmes bowed respectfully to Miss Hexley. "Your good name, madam, was the true commodity our conspirators sought to exploit. A counterfeit commission, fine boots delivered without request, payment demands phrased to suggest that refusal implied dishonorable evasion. These were the levers by which respectable households were moved into fearful silence. Your courage in refusing their demands helped expose the entire enterprise." Thomas Finch found his voice at last. "And old Greaves, sir? You say I did not?" "You did not," Holmes answered with absolute finality. "You began those boots months ago during your apprenticeship. Another hand finished them clumsily after your dismissal. Your documented anger provided Mortlake with his puppet, but your innocence was apparent to any who cared to look beyond the theatrical misdirection." Inspector Lestrade rose, the familiar lines of professional responsibility settling once more upon his weathered features. "Mortlake, Harker, and their associates will answer for forgery, blackmail, conspiracy, and whatever additional charges our legal experts devise for the indignities perpetrated upon a corpse. Finch, you are completely exonerated. Miss Hexley, if you wish, Scotland Yard will make it publicly known that you assisted our investigation." When our visitors had departed into the London night, I found Holmes at our window, gazing thoughtfully at the wet reflections of Baker Street's gaslight on rain-slicked cobblestones. The November storm had finally blown through, revealing faint stars above the chimney pots. "You are satisfied with the resolution, Holmes?" I inquired. "Insofar as any man may be satisfied when confronting the depths of human folly and malice," he replied, lighting his pipe with deliberate care. "We had no supernatural phantom here, Watson, only a heart that failed, and minds that chose the path of elaborate deception rather than honest and endeavor. The world remains so full of obvious things that no one ever observes." The blue spirals of tobacco smoke rose to meet the newly quiet night, as Holmes continued his philosophical reflection. A little mechanical tapping, a trace of orris powder, a clerk with expensive tastes beyond his honest income from such small inconsistencies. The entire edifice of lies inevitably crumbles. He turned from the window with that familiar expression of intellectual satisfaction tempered by worldly wisdom. "Send your account to the Strand magazine if you must, Watson. Only I would suggest changing the name of Cobbler's Lane in your narrative. London contains many narrow alleys where honest folk must pass after dark, and I should prefer that our future adversaries believe the fog their only witness to whatever phantoms they may choose to conjure." The case of the phantom cobbler had begun with supernatural whispers and mechanical histories, evolved through false accusations and elaborate frames, and concluded with the triumph of methodical investigation over ingenious deception. In the end, the most chilling monsters had proven to wear human faces, their phantoms merely clever shadows cast by their own dark designs. Justice had prevailed, innocence had been vindicated, and the fog that had so effectively shrouded criminal enterprise was finally lifting to allow the clear light of truth to illuminate even the darkest corners of London's labyrinthine streets. The December morning that followed brought crystalline air and brilliant sunshine, transforming London from the fog-shrouded labyrinth of our recent adventures into a city gleaming with renewed purpose. Holmes sat in his familiar chair beside our fireplace, examining the final piece of evidence, a small glass vial containing the peculiar compound used to render Mrs. Pemberton unconscious. Chloroform combined with oil of bergamot and essence of orris root. he announced with quiet satisfaction. A sophisticated mixture designed not merely to render victims unconscious, but to create temporary memory impairment. Mortlake possessed considerable chemical knowledge, suggesting education far beyond his current circumstances. Inspector Lestrade's morning visit brought news of the conspiracy's complete unraveling. Thomas Finch has secured honest employment with a respectable cobbler in Islington, he reported. Miss Hexley's name has been publicly vindicated, and Mrs. Pemberton has recovered sufficiently to resume her business, though she has permanently sealed the passage between premises. Holmes nodded approvingly, then began his methodical explanation of the remaining mysteries. The timing mechanism that created our phantom cobbler was ingenious in its simplicity, a leather strap drawn over a wooden peg, positioned beneath a pierced water pipe. As each drop struck the strap, it gradually stretched until a counterweight fell, striking the cobbler's hammer against a metal plate. The weight's descent simultaneously triggered the doorbell through an ingenious system of gut lines. But the sealed room, Holmes? I inquired, still marveling at the deception's complexity. Mortlake possessed a duplicate key from his surveillance of the premises. He would enter, wind the mechanism, then exit through Mrs. Pemberton's adjoining cupboard, wedging the inner bolt with an awl to suggest the room had been secured from within. The Scotland Yard seal was broken the first night, then carefully reapplied with warmed wax and a touch of orris root to mask the different composition. The detective moved to examine correspondence that had arrived that morning. I have received word from Cambridge regarding our Mr. Mortlake. He was indeed educated there, Trinity College. Natural sciences with particular attention to chemistry and metallurgy. Gambling debts led to his expulsion after forging a letter of credit, destroying what might have been a distinguished career. A tragedy of wasted potential, I observed. Indeed, Watson. Yet it explains his sophisticated methods and his bitter resentment toward respectable society. The phantom cobbler provided perfect camouflage for a systematic assault upon the very foundations of official documentation warrants. Certificates, letters of credit, even diplomatic passports. Holmes moved to our window, gazing thoughtfully at Baker Street's bustling morning activity. The metallic scent that troubled us proved to be nitric acid and copper salts, the breath of the etcher's trade. The orris root served multiple purposes, disguising the chloroform's harsh odor, providing the millinery connection that implicated poor Finch, and lending that distinctive floral note to the entire enterprise. And the small footprints, young Lena Baines, the seamstress forced to reset the mechanism and transport forged documents. Her shoes were removed to prevent nail marks in the cobbler's wax, a detail that might have betrayed the deception to a trained observer. A soft knock interrupted our discussion, and Constable Pike entered bearing a small parcel. "From Thomas Finch, sir. Says he owes you more than words can express." Holmes unwrapped the package to reveal a cobbler's hammer, newly polished and professionally restored. Upon the head, neatly stamped, were the initials S.G., and beneath them T.F. Master and apprentice united in honest craftsmanship. "An honest tool," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes softening momentarily. "Returned to honest purpose." When we were alone again, Holmes settled deeper into his chair, lighting his pipe with deliberate ceremony. "The phantom cobbler has taught us once again, Watson, that the most supernatural mysteries often conceal the most mundane human motivations. Greed, desperation, the desire for revenge, these remain the true phantoms that haunt our London streets." The blue spirals of tobacco smoke rose toward the ceiling as Holmes continued his philosophical reflection. Mortlake wove a tapestry of ghosts from mechanisms, scents, and official trappings. Yet he forgot the two certainties that unmake such designs: time, which loosens every knot, and detail, which betrays every hand. A wax crack no thicker than a hair, the roll of a thread's end, a fragment of lacquered wood, these are the cords that bind rogues as surely as iron chains. He smiled faintly, his keen gaze already scanning the morning papers for reports of fresh mysteries. The world remains so full of obvious things that no one ever observes, Watson. Send your account to the publishers if you wish, though I suggest you change the name of Cobbler's Lane in your narrative. London contains many narrow alleys where honest folk must pass after dark, and I should prefer that our future adversaries believe the fog their only witness to whatever phantoms they may choose to conjure. The case of the phantom cobbler had concluded with truth triumphant over elaborate deception. Yet Holmes's restless intellect was already anticipating the next challenge that London's inexhaustible capacity for mystery would inevitably provide.